As I mentioned, welcome all to this session. It is my privilege now to introduce our first speaker, Gerald Morgan. Welcome, Gerald. The title of his presentation will be David Jenkins, Professor David Jenkins, on the laws of Hywel Dda. And David Jenkins was a Welshman, a lawyer, a Welshman, a lawyer, teacher. So quite a lot of irons in that particular fire. Gerald said that his talk will be an ambitious attempt. Gerald himself is a teacher, historian, has been a secondary head teacher and a lecturer. He's an author of 25 books and scores of articles on history of Wales and Ceredigion, and he is now living in Aberystwyth. So, over to you, Gerald, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, an invitation which I had. Watching the script on the screen so that I can read it. When I was invited and to address you about David Jenkins, I was in the oncology ward in Singleton Hospital for 8 days. Now, you'd think that would be a convenient excuse to turn down any invitation. But refusal wasn't on the cards. Rather, the invitation was a challenge for me to recover and to think about more interesting things. And anyway, I'd known David, admired him, and liked him. So why wouldn't I be willing to talk about him? Oh, and the treatment, by the way, was successful. It was 1963 when I first made David's acquaintance, and it was an acquaintance. David didn't bestow his friendship easily. He was middle-aged, already a figure of importance in the fields of politics, literature, agriculture, and the law. And that was an unusual variety. As Sean said, he was prominent in politics, literature, law, and agriculture. I was exactly half David's age, and Enid and myself had just started our married life in Aberystwyth. The previous year, David had lost his dear wife, Gwyneth. In her last illness, Gwyneth asked her friend, Marion Henry Jones, to look after David. He can be a bit eccentric. By today, we might guess that he had a degree of Asperger's syndrome. David was born in 1911 in Hornsey, London, to a Welsh and Welsh-speaking family. He had one sister, Gwyneth, and they were the third generation of the family, a Welsh-speaking family in London. Their farmer was a bank clerk and secretary of Dewin, one of London's largest Welsh chapels. He was educated at one of London's most prominent schools, Merchant Taylors. I knew little about his childhood, apart from evidence I found in the Llyfrau Ystwyth bookshop a few months ago. There, I came across this volume with the Merchant Taylors' coat of arms stamped on the cover. The label inside says that it was a history prize awarded at Merchant Taylors School to David A. Jenkins, our David. But this is no ordinary book. Allwedd Paradwys i'r Cymru is a volume of Catholic prayers, printed secretly in 1670. And the complete text and complex was published by the University of Wales Press in 1929. Now, how on earth did a London schoolboy know about the University of Wales Press? And why was he interested in such an esoteric book? Well, this is simple evidence of David's depth of knowledge and thinking as a Welshman and a Christian. Almost from the outset, therefore, he was dedicated to the Welsh language and was interested in scholarship. He went on to City Sussex College, Cambridge, where he studied natural sciences for Part 1, and then turned to study law. He was called to the bar in 1934 at Gray's Inn, and moved then to the South Wales Legal Circuit, opening his own office in Carmarthen, a very young man to do so, in 1936. By then, he'd published a substantial article in Welsh in the Llenor on the ecclesiastical tradition of Canterbury. He didn't mention the cathedral, but rather the ideas of T.S. Eliot, the Church of England, and contemporary Catholicism. Before leaving London, Dafydd had joined the branch in the capital of Plaid Cymru, and would contribute occasional articles to the Ddraig Goch, the party's paper. He'd also left Jewin Chapel. It seemed that the visiting chapel preachers from Wales were tempted to use a great deal of English to show off, perhaps, and this didn't please Dafydd at all. Instead, the Welsh Church of St Benet did please him in its use of the Welsh language, as did St Margaret's, Westminster, for his high church adherence. He was very interested in religion. Also, before he left London, Dafydd became acquainted with Aneurin Talman Davies, who called himself Aneurin ap Talman at that time. Aneurin was a chemist, working as an assistant to the owner of a pharmacy in Watford, of all places. Dafydd was a frequent visitor, and the conversation would always cover a wide range of topics, particularly Christianity and Wales and its affairs. Aneurin was intensely interested in Welsh and in contemporary English literature, such as the poems of T.S. Eliot and the prose of James Joyce. Aneurin would compose poetry in Welsh, following the models of modern English poets, but he couldn't publish them in Wales because the chief literary periodical at that time was the Llenor, and its editor, W.J. Griffith, was scarcely interested in matters that were too up-to-date. So Aneurin proceeded, although he worked incredibly long hours in the shop, to establish his own journal, Heddiw. Because he couldn't afford to use a printer, he took it upon himself to print a page at a time in the back room of the chemist shop on a small Adana press. 500 copies were sold of Heddiw at the Fishguard Eisteddfod in 1936, and on the next edition, Dafydd Jenkins was named as assistant editor. Now, Dafydd wrote many articles and reviews for the magazine. Looking back in 1977, Dafydd would refer to the aims of Heddiw as those of the Left Book Club, discussing Wales and her affairs, like a Welsh New Statesman or Spectator. The magazine flourished until 1940, but then came the emergencies of war, particularly paper rationing. Aneurin had married and moved back to Swansea, just in time to suffer the Luftwaffe Blitz, when his home and business were destroyed, and Heddiw also perished. The two major issues of the second half of the 30s for Dafydd were legal status of the Welsh language and the protest of the Penllyn Free at the government's decision to establish a bombing school on the Llyn Peninsula and demolishing the small mansion of Penyberth. The negligible status of the Welsh language in the legal world was a long-standing problem, which had surfaced from time to time. The Judge Thomas Artemus Jones had been campaigning on the subject for some time, and as a judge had held the occasional court trial in Welsh only, with the consent of all parties in the teeth of the law of England. The subject came to prominence again, therefore, because of the court cases in Carnarvon and the Old Bailey. where the negligible status of the Welsh language became painfully apparent. Dafydd was present every day at Caernarfon and received detailed reports of the trial in London. And within a few months, he'd published his excellent book, Tân and Llyn, his first volume, and it's remarkable for its objectivity. At the same time, a group was formed to organise a national petition to Westminster to request for an improvement in the status of Welsh in law. Funds were raised for the cause, and David Jenkins was paid to be organiser, with an office in the old Urdd headquarters in Llanbadarn Road in 1938. David would travel in trains and cars the length and breadth of Wales, particularly in the south, speaking and canvassing. The hope was to obtain 500,000 names, but the threat of Adolf Hitler made the work increasingly difficult. And this was coupled with the reluctance of the Welsh people to subscribe enough of their money. The situation was also critical on a personal level for David himself for more than one reason. First of all, because of the financial situation, he had to give up his post and his own office. And then on a more basic level, David was a deeply convinced pacifist. In the spring of 1940, he went for a short time to Devon. The Society of Friends there, the Quakers, had organised agricultural courses so that conscientious objectors could prepare themselves for national service without involving the armed forces. And from there, David returned to Ceredigion and began working as a farm labourer. And before long, he became a farm tenant and then the owner of Trausnant, Llanrystud, which is still owned by his son today. But what about the petition? It had reached by 380,000 names, and it was a respectable total in the when you consider the situation then. Despite the dreadful conditions in the early years of the war, which became increasingly worse, the petition did not die. It's surprising that the government allowed time to discuss the matter at all. But two influential civil servants were keen to ensure that the Welsh MPs, and the majority of those, of course, were Labour or Liberals, and Welsh speakers, many of them, would maintain their support for the government. Despite its failings, the Act passed in 1942 was a small step forward and ensured some attention for the Welsh language. By the way, bearing in mind the National Library's achievement regarding the Welsh Women Peace petition, isn't it high time for a similar project on the Welsh language petition in 1938? A copy is available in Westminster, I'm sure. But by 1942, David the farmer had married Gwyneth Owen. It was an idyllic marriage, but ended abruptly when Gwyneth died 20 years later. They had one son, Rhys, and Rhys went on to have a distinguished academic career at Norwich University. He still has an excellent grasp of Welsh, and he greatly helped me in the preparation of this paper. Rhys has two children, David's grandchildren, and two great-grandchildren were born before David's death. After Gwyneth's death, David moved from Danacoed to live on the Vineyard in a small house built in the previous century by his maternal grandfather. He remained there for years before moving to one of the flats on the old school in North Road. Visitors who came to see him faced a problem because there was only one chair to sit on, his own. Yes, Gwyneth was right. He could be eccentric. And during their marriage, David had faithfully accompanied Gwyneth to Shiloh, her family's chapel. But sometime in the 70s, he returned to the church St Mary's, Llantyfair in Aberystwyth. And there, for the rest of his life, it was possible to witness another facet of David's oddity. He'd heard a priest, the Reverend Saunders Davies, later Bishop of Bangor, saying of the words in the communion service, Hosanna in the Corrichod, that they should be shouted. David took this literally, and in every service, communion service, his voice could be resounded through the church. He tended to be more eccentric with age, but this had no effect at all on his erudition. Even in old age, when he suffered an accident and fell on the streets in Aberystwyth, he overcame this, thanks to the extremely long, thick coat which he wore. And to those inquired after his health, he'd reply, "Soldiering on in injury time." But to return to the war, when David was farming in the parish of Llanrystyd. Merely working in agriculture wasn't enough. He remained enthusiastic about agriculture. He published works such as his booklet on income tax on the farmer. He also held evening classes under the auspices of the extramural department at Aberystwyth. And when the war ended, he worked for years for the Welsh Agricultural Society, where his legal background proved most advantageous. In 1958, he published a 300-page Law for Cooperatives. In 1976, when he was heavily involved in his work on the laws of Hywel Dda, he described himself as retired farmer and agricultural cooperator. His sense of humour. And in the midst of all his activity in 1948, he had activity time to work, historical work, published a short book on Thomas Johns of Haverfordwest. Even to date, this is the best study of Thomas Johns, and it's surprising that nobody up to now has published it in English. But this is what makes researching the life of David Jenkins exciting and disorganized at the same time. He followed several paths at the same time and found every one of them interesting. In 1941, he was a farmer. He published it, but he published his first article on the laws of Hywel Dda. 10 years then went by before he published a second. But by the 60s, the trickle had become a torrent. At the same time as his work on the laws of Hywel, he demonstrated his abiding interest in the principles of law beyond Wales. He published articles such as English Law and the Renaissance and Corporate Liability and the Doctrine of Ultra Vires, and this latter in the journal The Irish Jurist. Davies was very happy to discuss Welsh law in foreign periodicals, such as Welsh Medieval Law and Government in 1973, which was published in Brussels. I should note here that Welsh and English weren't only Davies' languages. He must have learned Latin and French at school, and he then learned German and could also speak Swedish. But let's slow down. We haven't finished with the 1950s yet. His interest in the cooperative movement had attracted him to the Scandinavian countries. He visited Denmark and published a small book on Denmark in 1951, Arwyb and Denmark, and a more substantial volume in 1959, Arwyb and Sweden. In addition to Davies' agricultural work, the gifted and energetic Alun R. Edwards had attracted him to assist with the Ceredigion Book Association. He directed the association's publishing work and became one of the most successful Welsh publishers of the 50s and the early 60s. There's one other red herring before we turn to Davies' work on the laws of Hywel Dda. With the disestablishment of the church in Wales in 1920, it was decided that its constitution as a legal basis for the new body. And it was done that the English text appeared quickly, but decades went by, probably under the encouragement of Archbishop D.O. Williams. David Jenkins and the scholars N.E. Pierce Roberts were asked to undertake the task. And of course, it had changed a bit by then. It was a great deal of work, considering the tension between legal accuracy and making sure that the language was correct and readable. This was the longest legal Welsh document that had been formed since medieval times. One unforeseeable result was that when Wales was granted a measure of autonomy, the need arose to draw up a bilingual constitution for the new Senedd. And the work of David Jenkins and N.P. Roberts was the Welsh model for this new historical document. Well, there's no turn to discuss the work that he did for the National Eisteddfod, or his work on the history of the Welsh novel, and his interest in the work of Gwilym Hiraethog. We return at last to David's magnum opus, his tremendous contribution to scholarship in the laws of Hywel Dda. David was the first lawyer to study the Welsh laws. There was a scholarly background to the field in the work of editors such as William Wotton, an Englishman who'd learned Welsh, and Moses Williams, and this was in the 18th century. And Eirin Owen in the following century, Timothy Lewis and Arthur Wade Evans in the early 20th century. The historians John Edward Lloyd and Goronwy Edwards had kept the subject alive, and in 1942, the text of Llyfr Blagowrid was published by Stephen J. Williams and Enoch Powell, of all people. There was a gap then until Melville Richards and Aled Rhys William published texts in 1951 and 1961. And they were followed in 1962 by a conference in Aberystwyth, the study of the Welsh law, the first of its kind in the field. And I remember attending there. Amongst the contributors was David Jenkins. Legal and comparative aspects of the Welsh laws, and a medieval family of Welsh lawgivers. In 1963, he published another text, Llyfr Colan. In 1965, he was appointed lecturer in the laws of Hywel Dda in the Law Department of Aberystwyth by Professor Llywelyn Davies, and he was awarded a personal chair 10 years later. Sorry, I'm losing the text for a moment. And before he retired in 1978. In his lecture, The Significance of the Law of Hywel, David demonstrated the basic difference between the English legal tradition and the laws of Wales. Kaiserrecht, or state law, was the basis of English law. Volksrecht, the people's law, is the basis of Welsh law. He showed how recent reforms in English law had similarities to the law of Hywel. For instance, in the issue of children of a marriage and illegitimate children being joint heirs of property, or in the different ways married women were treated in cases of divorce. He also demonstrated the importance of the Welsh language in the legal system, where English law still uses so much Norman French. One of his important publications was Celtic Law Papers in 1973. Although he's not named on the frontispiece, he was responsible for drawing together key papers by renowned scholars such as D.A. Binchy, Ian McNeill of Ireland, and Rudolf Turneisen from Germany, and placing the work of Hywel Emanuel on the Latin laws. Howell and his own work was side by side with those titans. He published this substantial volume, The Welsh Law of Women, in 1980, jointly with Morfydd Owen, who became a friend and colleague for the rest of his life. She was the chief authority on the laws of Howell following David's death. A volume was published in his honor in 1986 when he was 72 years old, Lawyers and Laymen. In 1999, Cymdeithas Hanner Cyfraith Cymru, the Welsh Law History Society, was established, which published annual booklets. The first booklet was presented to David Jenkins on his 90th birthday, and the second volume contained his lengthy article, Y Gymraeg mewn llys a llan. In his 80s, he gave a lecture in Austria, and when he was 90, he published an 80-page article on Welsh land law and made his last contribution when he was 99. He lived for a further 3 years, and following his death, he was buried in Joppa Cemetery, Llanrwstyd, close to the farm where he'd worked 60 years previously. And this is an imperfect history, one of the most able scholars of Wales during the 20th century. And Iolo Wyn Williams composed a poem to David on his 100th birthday. He is our leading counsel, our voice at every level. This we know, all Wales can tell. He is our second Howell. Excellent, thank you, Gerald. May I invite questions? If I can be cheeky and ask the first one. One of the things that struck me was how his interest in church law and civil law, how did they come together? Well, you'd have to ask somebody more competent than me in those areas. He was so multi-talented and discussed so many subjects. He could meld those subjects together. I really don't know how he did it. I can only see it from the outside. What was interesting to me also was how the influence of the laws of Howell was apparent even hundreds of years later, in the sense that it influenced the constitution of the Church in Wales, and also the way of the constitution of the Church in Wales influenced the constitution of the Senedd. That's most interesting. It is indeed. Any other questions for Gerald? As I said, there will be an opportunity at the end of the session to have a more informal chat. But are there questions that you'd like to ask particularly at this stage? Ainsley, you have your hand up? Well, not a question. Firstly, to thank Gerald. That was amazing. It was so interesting and such an amazing life and a rich, lengthy life. But to go on from Sean's question and the comment, the question then is the status of the law within Scripture and the relationship of the law with our lives as Christians, of course, because there's quite a lot of argument about the status of law in the New Testament, particularly in the books of Paul, and the tradition then, particularly after the Protestant Reformation, as to how we are justified by faith or in any other ways. But that emphasis, so it's most interesting. And I was just thinking how his Christian faith and the complex questions about the status of the law within the Christian tradition, how did that mix into his thinking as a lawyer and as somebody who was interested in Welsh literature and so on, and who was totally dedicated to the Christian faith? I'm not expecting you to answer that. I was just wondering, really, about this complex relationship that we have. Not just, of course, we need laws in the church as well as in the world. But there is something under the surface which raises questions about the law and the status of the law. And we see a different perspective again in the New Testament, in Matthew's Gospel, where it appears it is quite apparent that Jesus reinforces the law and increases the requirements. Well, thank you, Ainsley.
Well,
one thing I'd say, if anyone was less of a theologian than David, that person is me. I wouldn't claim any expertise in theology as such. But towards his attitude toward the law and the church, I would have to look in great detail, as I think you would have to see how you can judge. Because I referred to his interest in law generally, not just the law of Howell, and not just those two articles I referred to. There are several others as well as to what law is and how it operates generally. But there are no theological aspects to those as far as I can discern. Thank you. Rhydian, your hand is up. Thank you. And thank you for bringing a lot of memories to David Jenkins. I had the privilege of knowing him in Aberystwyth. And as a constant user of the National Library, he was very definite in his opinions on all sorts of subjects. But one personal memory I have of him is which ties to his longevity, I think. And it was in 2011, the library celebrated the centenary of setting the foundation stone when the library was established by charter in 1907, but the foundation stone for the present building was laid in 1911, the year David was born. And we had a celebration. People were invited to surround the library, holding hands around the building. And David was standing with the president at the time, David Wigley, and we were honouring David because he was the oldest reader who still attended the library, and because he was 100 years, the same age as the building. And at the end of the celebration, I had been invited to lead everyone to sing Hen Mladwen Hadau. And I remember standing close to David and hearing him singing, 100 years old, the national anthem with gusto. And that seemed to summarize all his career. It's a personal memory, and thank you very much, Gerald. Rhydian, thank you, that's brilliant. Any other final questions? If not, we'll have a short break before restarting at 11:15. Kerry, did you want to ask a question? I see you've unmuted. No, not to ask a question. Am I heard? Yes, you are. If I could just thank Gerald, he'd brought back many memories, as did Rhydian, and going back further than Gerald to 1963, even to the 50s. I remember Dafydd and Gwynedd and Rhys, who was a bit younger than me, and Mrs. Jenkins lived in a flat next to her. I remember her very well. And there was a great deal of friendship from the family. We can only wonder not only at the breadth of his knowledge, but his detail in everything. But he was definitely his own man. He followed his own convictions. And when I met him, very often in the National Library, he was very often there on a Saturday. He would very often raise some matter concerning a particular word, perhaps a particular Latin word. And there's a lot of, he'd chase some particular words, and what is the origin, and what are all its implications. And I remember him, and Gwyneth, his wife also. They were very special people, and of course contributions in the studies of law have been, as Gerald said, to somebody who hasn't mastered that field, but his contribution with people such as Arwyn and Thomas Charles Edwards has been exceptional. Thank you, Gerald, for bringing to mind a very special person. Thank you, Kerry. And thank you again, Gerald, for a very interesting talk. Thanks again to Gerald. And we now want to introduce Rhydian. We're very pleased and appreciative that you've been happy to contribute to this session. And the name of the session is Church Hymnals in the 20th Century. And the purpose of the presentation is to look over the collections of hymns and tunes published by the Church in Wales during the 20th century. And there's Emynau'r Eglwys, Emynau Hen and Eglwys. And Rhydian will also talk about his features. Rhydian also lives in Aberystwyth, like Gerald, as a member of the National Library of Wales staff for 28 years and has now retired. He's interested in various aspects of the history of music in Wales, including congregational singing and hymns. He's also the president of the Welsh Hymn Society, an association generating interest in hymns. So welcome, Rhydian, and thank you for being willing to talk to us on this subject. Over to you, Rhydian. Thank you very much, Sean, for your kind introduction. I hope you can all see the screen. Well, in the first quarter of the 20th century, collections of hymns and tunes first published in the previous century were still in vogue in the Church in Wales, particularly so Hymnau'r Eglwys by Ellis Wyn o Wyrfai and Emyniadur yr Eglwys yng Nghymru by Bishop Daniel Lewis Lloyd. The Emyniadur was published in the 1890s, but new editions appeared in 1926 and 1936, for instance. Ellis Wyn's volume, Hymnau'r Eglwys, was published in 1886, and the musical edition in 1892. Thanks to Richard Hughes's research into the publishing house of Sbirrel in Carmarthen, we know that the volume went through several editions after 1900, with a total of 37 editions by 1934. Hymnau'r Eglwys certainly proved to be a commercial success for the publishers, and Mr. Hughes estimates that 100,000 copies of the book had been sold, different editions, by 1927. And here are the figures in his work on Sbirrel's work. I haven't seen similar figures as proofs of the sales of the Emyniadur, but one may deduce bearing in mind that the various editions, that book sold well and it had been in general use. Well, what reason was there to consider a new collection for the Church in Wales? Well, by the end of the first quarter of the 20th century, the religious and social climate was very different from that of the Victorian age. The First World War had been and gone and had left its mark negatively by shaking the foundations of the faith of many, and positively by fostering new hope for international cooperation. In the era of hymns particularly, this gave rise to a desire for new and more contemporary hymns that were social, national, and international in nature. The Church in Wales was also a very different body after 1920. A disestablished church which sought in different ways to develop a Welsh character while remaining true to its Anglican roots and traditions. On a linguistic level, the publication of Orgraff yr Iaith Gymraeg in 1928 had set new standards of Welsh syntax and spelling, standards which would be generally accepted and which would make hymns published in the old orthography appear antiquated. Musically also, there had been substantial development in musical education through the establishment of new courses at the University of Wales and in the schools, with the musicians trained there setting new standards in Welsh music. More than that, other sections of the Christian Church in Wales had published new collections. The Baptist Llawlyfr Moliant in 1915, the Caniadydd Cynulleidfaol Newydd by the Congregationalist in 1921, and the combined collection of the two Methodist churches, Calvinist and Wesleyan, in 1927, with the version with tunes appearing in 1929. This last collection was the first among the hymnals in Welsh to adopt the revised orthography. It wasn't easy to adapt the old books to reflect these developments. Consider the musical edition of Hymnau yr Eglwys, Elis Wynno Urfau. Spiral staff notation and solfa were in stereotype, that is, printing plates, which could be changed only at vast expense. The company had also been corresponding with the lexicographer Bod van Anwyl on the issue of amending the orthography of the words, but it came to the conclusion that the task would be far too expensive. Moreover, sales of the volume had slowed down, possibly because the market had been saturated, and by the 1930s, Spurrell was selling Hymnau yr Eglwys at half price. By then, it was also widely known that plans were afoot to produce a new anthology of hymns, which would not only adhere to the standards of the new orthography and reflect the latest theological and social developments, but would also be an original production of the Church in Wales after disestablishment. The result of these attempts was the collection Hymnau'r Eglwys. And the preface to the volume gives us a glimpse of the way it was produced. After following previous unsuccessful attempts, a committee was established in September 1934 by the governing body of the Church in Wales and was entrusted with the task of preparing a new Welsh hymnal. It's interesting to note here the emphasis of the governing body's authority in commissioning the book, whereas previous volumes had chiefly been individual attempts. We might perceive here some feeling of an attempt in the name of the Church as a whole, an attempt which would possibly seek to reinforce the character of the disestablished body, and the committee was chaired by the Archbishop of Wales. The preface also notes that other denominations had produced new books, which is an interesting comparison, since each of the nonconformist denominations used their hymnals as a badge of identity. and this might possibly have been in the minds of the church leaders as well. A general committee and a text committee were established, and then in May 1935, a subcommittee of 4 to supervise the materials collected to date and to design the book. And by April 1937, this work had been completed, and the following year, proof sheets were twice distributed to all the members of the text committee and the general committee. Both committees met in February 1939, when the design for the book was accepted unanimously, subject to essential or desired corrections and amendments. A series of supplementary suggestions were discussed by the General Committee at 3 meetings between December 1939 and April 1940. And I quote again from the preface. The work was obviously undertaken very thoroughly, and bearing in mind that the Second World War had broken out in 1939, the committee should be commended for completing their work under such difficult circumstances. A list of all the members of the contributing committees is appended at the end of the preface, and it's obvious that the Church took its task seriously. The General Committee comprised 27 members, not including 2 honorary secretaries, 19 on the Text Committee, 4 on the Text Subcommittee, and 15 on the Music Committee, with 2 additional advisory members. The text edition was published in 1941, but partly due to war conditions, the publication of the music edition had to wait until 1951. The vast majority of the members were priests, but the contribution of one layman is particularly mentioned, namely S.J. Evans of Menai Bridge, who did much of the early organizational work before his death in 1937. It's interesting, though not unexpected, bearing in mind the period, that there was only one female member of the committee, Mrs. Ceridwen Lloyd Davis, the wife of a priest and a lecturer in music at Bangor and later at Carmarthen, who served as a member of the music committee. The aim of the compiler, says the preface, was to formulate a comprehensive book, rich in content and varied enough to meet every need and circumstance where hymns would be required. A name probably shared by the editors of all collections over the years. There's a quotation in the preface from Julian's Dictionary of Hymnology. And Julian says in 1892 that the deficit in Welsh hymnology was an excessive emphasis on the elements of personal experience and a lack of hymns on the sacraments. Well, that could be argued, but one can also be certain that the editors of Emyna'r Eglwys took care to ensure the inclusion of hymns to meet the requirements of every season, every celebration, and every sacrament. The structure of the collection is clear and robust, reflecting the church year, saints' days, specific times and seasons, the sacraments, with general hymns and hymns on themes such as the church and the world, and hymns for youth. And the indices also are a model of thoroughness. Looking at the musical edition published in 1951, I'd venture to say that this is the most comprehensive and complete hymnal which Wales has ever seen. Edited to a high standard, with extensive sections of proper anthems, liturgical settings, canticles and psalms, and an extremely interesting and valuable section, the religious songs of the Welsh through the centuries, which include settings by Welsh musicians of classical poems and hymns, such as David de Lloyd's setting of the medieval hymn Gogoneddau Garglwydd. In a review published in the Musical Times in 1952, and it's possible that this is the only Welsh hymnal which was reviewed in the Musical Times. I'm not certain of that. But Arwel Hughes in 1952 was full of praise for the book and appreciated that it included the work of several contemporary Welsh musicians. It contained a tune by Mansell Thomas, for instance. As regards the selection of hymns, there are many, particularly relating to the saints and festivals, derived from an ecclesiastical tradition, side by side with classics belonging to all traditions. Naturally enough, one can sometimes disagree with the selection, particularly perhaps in the youth section, an area which saw so much change over recent generations, particularly in the last few years. It's rather surprising, for instance, to see Emrys's hymn to the cross, O Iesu Mawr, pwy ont ydi, a llasai farw drosom ni, in the youth section, but extremely polished and comprehensive, containing a little over 600 hymns, not to mention other material, psalms, canticles, and so on, and the obvious influence of classical collections such as the English hymnal of 1906, it was apparent. But I wonder whether a Mynna'r Eglwys was perhaps a bit too ambitious. With the inclusion of musical settings, plain song settings, is the musical menu a bit too luxurious for small churches, which would be more dependent merely on the hymns and psalms? Do we have here too rich a high church confection, bearing in mind that the Bishop of Llandaff and Archbishop of Wales, John Morgan, a man of high church convictions, was chairman of the committee, and that Henry Walford Davis, and following his death, William H. Harris, organist of St. George's Church, Windsor, led the music committee. When the volume was reprinted in the 1970s, an abbreviated version was created, which omitted pages 540 to 776, the most ambitious musical sections, and a slimmer volume published, not only to save money, but probably because those sections were only infrequently used. Despite the authority of the governing body and the chairmanship of the Archbishop, Mynna'r Eglwys was not the official hymnal of the Church in Wales. As with the Anglican Church in England, the Church in Wales adhered to the pattern of providing books without officially exhorting congregations to use them. That is, there's no denominational book, as in the case of the nonconformist denominations. Over the years, the books had been individual or group productions, and although extensively used, of course, it couldn't be taken for granted that any one church would use any one particular book. It may also be that Mynna'r Eglwys had proved more for the south than the north. Indeed, although the Mynna'r Eglwys committees did have representatives from Bangor and St Asaph, it's fair to say that those committees were weighted in terms of representation in favour of the southern diocese. Of course, there's no explanatory preface which states this in black and white. But the former Archbishop Barry Morgan, for instance, brought up in the Brynamman area on the border between Glamorganshire and Carmarthenshire that the state of the book of his childhood was Mynna'r Eglwys, and he recognises that he wasn't aware of the books used, for instance, in Bangor. He admits that he has the name of the Diocese of Bangor. But it wasn't entirely unexpected that another circle within the church in Wales would produce a different collection. Emynau Hen a Newydd was published under the auspices of the Bangor Diocesan Music Committee, but not only for the use of the church in the diocese. This book, states the preface, was produced at the request of many parishes the length and breadth of Wales, which felt the need for such a collection. I wonder whether those parishes felt the need to have an alternative choice to Winner Eglwys, because some of its content was perhaps too highbrow, if I may, perhaps too academic for them. Be that as it may, the committee members who drew up this plea were priests, lay people, and musicians from Bangor, Carnarvonshire, and Anglesey were the members. In this case, with DJ Rowlands of Ellinhelly being the musical editor, and Enid Pierce Roberts of Bangor, a lecturer in the Department of Welsh at the University College of North Wales, Bangor, editing the words. The volume appeared in 1954 as an edition of the text with the tunes in solfa only, and it was distributed by officials of the committee. As you can see, it was a local effort. Emynau Hen y Newydd contains a little over 500 hymns, and the emphasis is definitely more congregational than choral. There are no choral settings. There are hymns under various headings relevant to the church year, reflecting the normal pattern found in books of the church, which are structured to accompany the prayer book. There's also a social aspect, hymns for those overseas, for those traveling by air. And that was a modern feature, and national hymns. Although two national hymns might sound a bit strange to our ears today. Dyw cadw'n milwyr o awr I awr, gwna hwyn goncwerwyr hyd doriad gwawr, as one, and o frenin mawr y byd, am ddiffyn di o hyd, deyrn Prydain fawr. That is God Save the King. But most of the content, as in the case of Emynau Eglwys, represents a good selection of hymns from several traditions, with Pontycelyn and Griffiths and Morgan Rhys among the classics, and Moelwyn, D. Tegwyn Evans, Nantllais, and J.T. Job, for instance, from a later generation, which again reflects what I suggested in an earlier presentation, that the Church in Wales hymnals are much more Catholic, quote, in the sense of weaving together the tradition of church hymns and the nonconformist tradition, more so than the nonconformist denominational books, which concentrated on their own traditions and tended to ignore the hymns of the ecclesiastical tradition. The tunes were published in staff notation without the text in 1956. And that's the frontispiece you can see here. And the staff notation states, this book is provided for organists. The words cannot be included due to the cost. Looking at that volume, that is without considering the words, it may be said that the tunes selected are more popular than the selection seen in Emynau Eglwys, and possibly better suited to sparser congregations in small parishes which didn't have extensive musical resources. For example, there aren't any tunes by contemporary Welsh composers as in Emynau Eglwys, and the tunes are also lifted directly from other sources without being typeset again to create any typographical uniformity. That, of course, was a means of saving costs. You can see an example here of Leone from one source, Belmont from another, Southwell, perhaps from the same as Belmont, and Bryn Calvaria in manuscript. And that's the variety you get within Emynau Hen y Newydd. By the 1950s, therefore, there were two contemporary collections in Welsh, circulating and coexisting in parishes in the Church in Wales. This situation persisted for nearly half a century. But of course, New hymns and tunes were being composed, and more importantly, the world was changing, and church congregations had to reflect this by singing more contemporary material, as well as the familiar classics. In the preface to the musical edition of Emynau Llan, published in 1997, we read the preface: almost 60 years have passed since the Church in Wales published Emynau'r Eglwys, and more than 40 years have gone since Emynau Hen a Newydd appeared, published by a special committee in the Diocese of Bangor. These are the two books we as church people have depended on for so long. By then, Emynau Hen a Newydd had sold out. So rather than reprinting, the Bangor Diocesan Music Committee decided to make good the deficiency by publishing what was called a concise collection of hymns, called Emynau Llan. So Emynau Llan was a kind of child of Emynau Hen a Newydd, again produced by Bangor, with the text, the words edition appearing in 1990 with 350 hymns, an appendix of 50 additional hymns in 1995, and the complete edition of 400 hymns with tunes in both notations in 1997. And you can see here an example of the hymn and with the both notation. Emynau Llan contains hymns, no psalms or canticles, but it is obviously an attempt to make church worship more contemporary by taking note of newer elements. The collection contains a number of contemporary hymns side by side with the traditional ones, the work of hymn writers from many denominations such as Edwin Morgan, Vernon Lewis, Arthur Williams, Rhys Nicholas, as well as church hymn writers such as Geraint Wyn Edwards, J. Edward Williams, Mary Clwyd, and R. Glyndwr Williams. The structure of the book, as with Emynau Hen a Newydd, is simpler than that of Emynau'r Eglwys, but naturally attention is paid to the feast days and saint days, and a good provision of more general hymns. The special contribution of the Bangor Diocesan Music Committee deserved recognition for its attempts to fulfill the need for new material to add to the hymnals circulating in the churches. They did this by producing booklets of music for special occasions, including communion and evening prayer and Thanksgiving services, and seeking to keep worship and church contemporary by providing new hymns, including 2 volumes of hymns for children called Cenwch yn Llafar. For the year 2000, the collection Mawl y Millennium was published. The Bangor Diocesan Worship Development Group were responsible for this by now, and the book includes psalms and a sermon, as well as new hymns. Another contribution by the Diocese of Bangor included booklets of carols. 1948 saw a new edition of Cys Eos Llechyd, a collection of Welsh carols first published in 1867, and it's an important contribution to the repertoire of plygeiniau at a time when the plygain tradition wasn't as prominent as it is today. Different in nature, but nevertheless extremely useful, are the 2 volumes of Llyfr Carolau Bangor, with carols in Welsh and English, which appeared in the 1950s, with both notations in the same booklet. These contain various well-known carols from many traditions, good number of them translations from other languages, but some also from the Welsh tradition. Then 1974 saw an extremely interesting enterprise edited by Alan Luff, Llyfr Carolau Deiniol, which included 14 new settings of traditional Welsh carols, the work of the prominent musicians Matel Thomas, Robert Smith, John Howell, and Enid Luff. In many respects, it's a shame that this work hasn't attracted more general interest. Although not all the settings are easy, they are rich and varied. And it was the Diocese of Bangor, yet again, which produced the collection Cyth Mawddwy in 1982, with a professor by the Reverend Geraint Vaughan Jones, who was a neighbour of mine for some years. And Geraint, of course, would be later responsible for the 2 volumes Hen Garolau Plygain, books which have enriched the Plygainiau and have helped to rekindle the recent revival in the Plygain tradition with traditional Welsh carols such as Te Gwawrio Borerydd, Tramwywn ar Gyflym Adenydd, Mil Henffydd Fore Wawr, and Dyddiau Hyfryd. This was a continuation of the legacy of Eos Llechyd. And although Plygainiau are held in a variety of locations by now, and people take pride in the Plygain as an ancient Welsh tradition, it's important to remember that the Plygain is a church service and a tradition which binds practices today with the revered history of our Christian tradition in Wales. Well, to conclude this talk, in 1994, a committee was established on behalf of the Union of Welsh Congregationalists, the Welsh Baptist Union, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church of Wales, and the Church in Wales to create a multi-denominational book of hymns and tunes. The result of this cooperation was the publication of Caneuon Ffydd in the beginning of 2001, at the dawn of the new century. Well, it started in 2001. Since I took part in preparing Caneuon Ffydd, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say anything about that volume. I am more aware than anyone of its weaknesses and deficiencies, and I'm still amazed that a multi-denominational committee succeeded in the task of producing a book which is in fairly general use. But I would like to say one thing. One of the liveliest, most interesting, most enlightened and wise contributors to the Caneuon Ffydd committees was the late Dr. Enid Pearce-Roberts, one who played a major part in the making of Emynau Hen a Newydd in the 1950s, Emynau Llan in the 1990s, and many other publications. Glyndwr Williams says of her in the introduction to the second volume of Cenwch yn Llabar for children, we are greatly indebted to her for her multifarious favours, and I'd say amen to that. I hope I'm not presuming too much in dedicating this talk today and earlier talks of mine on the hymnals of the Church in Wales to her beloved memory. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Rhydian. That was most interesting. I must say, I disagree with one thing. The supposed weaknesses of Caneuon Ffydd. That is, this is the standard volume. So thank you very much. Most interesting. May I invite questions? Enid? If you could you unmute yourself? Yeah. Yeah. I noted a key part of Enid Pearce-Roberts is a key part in all this. When I was editing the Llan in the 70s, I wrote to Enid P. I'd noted so many different hymnals there were, and I wrote to her asking, could you write a bit for the Llan explaining why there are so many hymnals? I got a typical letter. All the history is totally shameful and it's best forgotten. I don't know what was responsible for that, but I suspect that the high church element of the church, I remember talking to David Williams, who was director of the publications in Church in Wales at the period, saying that the hymns had been said far too high. So than in the other hymn books, and that suggested that they were set aim for choral singing, and that was the reason for the different hymns. I didn't realise in asking NEP that she was part of editing all these books, and why she was so fierce, I don't know. But I was too scared to ask her for anything else. Very fair point. I'm sure the people who have been her pupils would echo that. When I was at the university, she used to fall out with David Jenkins in translating the Constitution. David wanted everything to be legally correct, and she said, well, how can anybody understand it? It's no use to anybody if nobody can understand it. Very fair point. Thank you, Enid. Any other questions for Rhydian? Dyfryn? Thank you. And thank you, Rhydian, for your comprehensive presentation. I have a comment, really. When I was a curate in Llantysil, in charge of 6 churches, each of the churches had different hymn books. One used Emyna'r Llan, the other Emyna'r Hen a Newydd, and another still using the Emyniadur. And this was back in 2005. But what struck me at the time was that the same hymns were sung in all the churches. That is, the majority of churches. There were only really about 24 hymns that form can I call it the backbone of congregational singing? And this leads to the question, one of the things that's very difficult in introducing new hymns to the congregations and making them, rooting them in that church. And I think we move perhaps from the time of the hymn books so that people can make their own choices and having leaflets. I don't know whether you have any comments on that. Yes, thank you, Dyfrig. Most interesting, yes. I'm sure that's true. It's generally true, not just within the church in Wales, I think, but in non-conformist congregations, they have a fairly limited circle of hymns. But part of the intention of the Bangor Diocesan Committee was to try to introduce new hymns by publishing these booklets and having annual publications, as the non-conformists are used to producing selections, and some of those hymns are taken by the congregation, but it's always been difficult. It would be quite a task to try to analyze all the books over the years and try to decide what percentage of hymns have never been used. One would suspect that it's a fairly small percentage, and certainly a smaller percentage would have become familiar to people. Because there's only so many hymns that you can keep in your memory, and it's only the people who are perhaps hymn anoraks who go and learn all sorts of different and strange and unusual hymns. And what is true, I think, of every committee that's ever drawn up a hymn book, a committee creates a collection, or we must provide this. But there's a gap between a committee's opinion and what is useful, and what's going to be useful for the congregation. That gap has always existed with every book, and there is no one single book has been produced where all the hymns have been included. By now, of course, we move beyond the world of the book, and there's more use of hymns on screen. And that has possibilities because you can provide new things fairly easily and people can learn new things. So, on one sense, there's more hope, but I think you're quite right that the selection will become narrower. Naturally, I think we tend to think, oh, we need to think something that's familiar. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Ainsley. I apologize. I wasn't quite sure whether to make a comment or not, but thank you for both talks this morning. And the fact that we hear about characters we all know. I remember David Jenkins, and that is excellent. I think we've been talking about the friends, very familiar friends in this, because I'm holding one of them here, the Ymynar Eglwys. Ymynar Eglwys is a particular friend of mine, but I have a question about Ymynar Eglwys. You've mentioned that it is a volume which is Catholic in that sense. And I think it's Catholic in the sense of being comprehensive and inclusive, but also with, I think, a leaning towards the Catholic rather than the Low Church tradition. I was struck looking at the pages of Ymynar Eglwys. How many hymns have come from other languages, particularly Latin, and some from Greek as well? The first hymn, number 1, is in Advent. I have to take my spec. Creator Alma Sigurum. The print was very small. From the 7th century and the second, from the 10th century, the third from the Breviarium Romanum, and going on back it out from the German tradition, and then from the 6th century. But there are original and more contemporary ones, of course. But what's the purpose, you think, of the editors, the committee, as regards trying to commission new translations of these ancient hymns and commending them to the Welsh congregation of the Church in Wales? It's a major project, isn't it? And goes much further, goes beyond in history than one William Pantycelyn, for instance. Yes. Yes, you can answer that. I think there is an attempt, I don't know whether it was deliberately so, but obviously the influence of the English hymnal was strong on those responsible for Ymynar Eglwys, not only in the translations of the classics, but in the plain song settings as well. Those were set particularly for Ymynar Eglwys. Somebody asked them to compose the settings. And of course, that has not been such a strong tradition in Wales. I don't know how strong it is even in the cathedrals. But I think in most parish churches, where the tradition, I'd say this is an impression from the outside, the tradition has been more closer to the grassroots, perhaps, they've safeguarded the tradition of the metrical psalms, for instance, and then an anthem tradition. When you look at the sort of anthems created by Welsh composers for churches in the 18th century and the 19th century, they're fairly simple. They are congregational. A congregation could cope with them. And perhaps the choir might be very large in a small village, for instance. That is the feeling I get looking at Emyna'r Eglwys. The influence of the English hymnal is there, which of course had developed a mythological status almost within the church by then. And I wonder, perhaps, did the church in Wales say, oh, we must prove ourselves as a church in Wales and create something which competes with it, but perhaps didn't quite meld with the feeling of the general congregation? I don't know. Thank you, Rhyddian. Thank you. John? Thank you, Sean. And thank you for the talks this morning. They've been excellent. Two comments.
Helo, diolch Sean.
Emyna'r Hen a Newydd and Emyna'r Eglwys, do they reflect what existed in England, hymns ancient and modern, and the English hymnal? And of course, with the English hymnal, Vaughan Williams was one of the editors, and I'm sure that he had some input, and he cooperated with Caradog Roberts, of course, very frequently. There was some, he must have had some input. I'm only guessing, but did he have input into Emyna'r Eglwys? And the second point with Emyna'r Eglwys, many of the translations are the work of the Welsh professor William Harris, and he was a high churchman. He was known as, you called somebody father, they called him Pope Bill, and he was a very, his daughter Llywela died a few months ago. She had to do a lot with the music, the St David's Music Festival. But does Rhyddian know anything about a man called, was it Hugh Hughes or Hubert Hughes? His son was vicar of Morriston when I was a lad. Hubert Hughes. And I think a hymn of his father's work, Ben Will they call him, and Hubert Benjamin William was the name of my former vicar, Hubert Hughes. Does Rhyddian know anything about him? I think his father was a music teacher in the college school in Lampeter. Yes, he lived in Lampeter. Hugh Hughes was began as a Wesleyan because when the Methodist hymnal was created, the one published in 1929, Hugh Hughes was one of the Wesleyan representatives on the committee, and the Venwyl tune is in the Methodist hymn book. I never heard anybody singing it, but the tune is there. And Eric Routley, in his volume, The Music of Christian Unity, praises the tune as a good example of a developed Welsh tune. Be that as it may, Hugh Hughes moved to Lampeter. Well, he lived in Lampeter, but he became the organist, the church organist in Lampeter, and he was the organist. St Peter, I think, St Peter's in Lampeter. And he would teach in the college at the same time. And you're talking about William Harris. There's oddly enough, there are two W.H. Harrises involved with Emyna'r Eglwys. One, the Lampeter, who was treasurer of the St David's Cathedral, and William H. Carys was the name of the organist of St. George's in Windsor, and came from outside, but he steered the music committee, and he followed Walford Davis, who died in 1941, and then William Harris of Windsor undertook the work. So there's two William H. Harrises involved with the book, which is very confusing, and you have to be careful as to which one you're talking about. But that's the one I remember. And I think that Eluned has given a message in the chat about the family, doesn't she? Yes. Yes, and new Hughes, and he has two sons. One is a bishop in America, and then the other a priest in Llandrindod. Thank you. Yes. Right. We've passed, it's gone 11:30, so our formal session is at an end. So you're welcome to stay for a more informal chat once the recording has ended. So if I may, on your behalf, I'd like to thank Gerald and Rhydian for their extremely interesting work. It's been a pleasure to be here and hearing more about the hymnal from Rhydian and about David Jenkins from Gerald. So thank you both, and thank you everyone who's been part of the session.
David Jenkins oddi wrth Gerald. Felly, diolch o galon I chi'ch dau. Diolch I bawb sydd wedi bod yn rhan o'r sesiwn heno heddiw.